nice and intimate. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, as I said in the introduction. I'm actually a fellow with Frog now, so I was a creative director with them for about 10 years, working on all sorts of different projects. And if you don't know Frog Design, they're a global innovation firm, and they design everything from sort of toothbrushes to cars. About 1,600 people around the world doing great work. I'm from Australia originally, as you can tell from my accent, and I left a couple of years ago really to put down my opinion of this process of what I call disruptive thinking, which is what I believe is necessary from dealing with companies all around the world on their innovation strategies. What's necessary to spark disruptive innovation, right? It's that first step. Because there was an expression, as I worked for all these companies around the world, there was this one expression, particularly in the last 5 years, that I started hearing again and again and again. And this was this expression: Luke, we do not need any more ideas. We've got more ideas than we know what to do with. And I thought, well, great. They felt like they were almost had so many ideas they did not know which direction to go in. I mean, have you ever felt that? Got so many ideas bouncing around in your head. I heard it accurately described one day as paralyzed by possibility. I think that's great. And I can understand why companies feel that way. But a funny thing happens. When I asked to see the ideas, they'd start backpedaling a little bit. Well, we don't have them written down or anything, right? That's one of the problems right there. Most ideas in businesses don't exist in anything but water cooler conversations. People are just talking about them and they remain abstract in their head and they can't do anything with it. But the second problem, when we actually did see the ideas, or were lucky enough to see them, they were incremental ideas almost 100% of the time. And this is very dangerous for a company to just embrace incremental change. So ideas that support their existing way of doing the business. Ideas that support the current business model, support the existing products and services they're already making. And it's dangerous because they get on this narrow path. And this path gets narrower and narrower and narrower as they're doing these small incremental changes. But sooner or later they reach the end of this path, and by then the customers have forsaken them for another offering that nobody saw coming. Least of all, the business itself. Now, if they do make big or take big disruptive risks, ideas that aren't incremental, it's only because they've been backed into a corner and there's no other choice. So Clayton Christensen wrote about this in The Innovator's Dilemma. I mean, back in the 90s, this endless cycle, the disruptor becomes a disruptee. So we're all aware of it intellectually. These companies are aware of the problem, but they don't seem to be able to break through of this sort of incrementalism. And what I started noticing is when people were talking about disruptive innovation, they were really referring to disruptive technology, because that's really where the Innovator's Dilemma started, right? These new technologies come on the market, and the market's so small for them that the established players don't care about them. There's not enough money in it for them, and it threatens their existing model. But these new technologies grow in influence over time and eventually surpass the old systems. So it all became about these companies, about how to spot and react to these new technologies. Okay, so don't ignore it. Make sure you're paying attention to changes in the environment and don't be left behind. But this is the gap I discovered, and this is why I was motivated to write the book. It's not about how to spot and react to new disruptive innovations and technology. It's about how to be the disruptive change. And I don't see nearly enough companies deliberately trying to be that disruptive change in the marketplace. And it's a completely different skill set than just being able to spot and react. It's a difference between prediction and provocation. And I'll give you an example. Has anyone seen the film Psycho? Okay, most people, right. And what's the most famous scene in that movie? The shower scene, right. So if I do that, actually I've never been able to see anyone do this without going, ee, ee, ee. Right. Now, can anyone tell me, before she got stabbed in the shower, where did the movie start? Famous Alfred Hitchcock film, Psycho. Before she got stabbed in the shower, where did the movie start out? Yep, she was in the motel. That's where she got killed. What was it?
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, in the motel, yeah. Now, why were they in the motel? I mean, where did they start out? Does anyone remember it all? It wasn't a business, yes. So I'll save us all a lot of time because I don't get this answer very long. But if I had a sticker, I would give one to you for sure. So it started out, she'd embezzled some money from a company, all right? The money was in a suitcase, it was in the trunk of the car, they were on the run. So the film started out as a caper film. And they're on the run and they got tired, started raining, pulled over to the side, got into the motel. Then all of a sudden she's relaxing, taking a shower, right? She gets stabbed, which caught the audience by surprise, right? It was unexpected. They're thinking, why did they kill her? They didn't even know the money was in the car. I mean, who was this? I mean, how did they trace her down? What on earth is going on? Right. Now, this in Hollywood terms is known as a turning point. And it was one of Alfred Hitchcock started to pioneer turning points. Now, a turning point catches the audience by surprise, and all good movies have them. Sparks their curiosity, right? They're curious to see where this is going. But most importantly, it takes the film in another direction, right? Changes the trajectory. So it's no longer a caper film. This is now a thriller. But turning points don't just exist in movies. They exist in business. And every great disruptive innovation has come about through an innovator who has found a turning point that has taken their segment, category, or industry in another direction. Frog Design has a long history of working with Apple, and I'm going to tell you an example of early Steve Jobs, and not many people have been talking about early Steve Jobs. This is back in 1982. They'd had a little bit of success at Apple, but certainly not the company it is now. He'd seen what design could do for companies like Sony, Louis Vuitton. He wanted the same success for Apple, so he started working with this little firm called Frog Design in Germany. They moved to America as a result to start working with Steve. And they started working on a project called Snow White. It was called Snow White because what Steve Jobs wanted was an exploration of 7 products that would define the future of Apple. What's the essence of the brand? Where would Apple go? So Snow White and the 7 Dwarves. So I won't go through what all the dwarves were, but I will say the project was very influential. Led to the development of the first Apple Mac SE. It's hugely influential. The interesting part of the story is the brief that Steve Jobs gave Frog Design. I mean, you know when you get a brief, and I'm sure you've all written them, you've responded to them, it's normally pages and pages of requirements, right? Particularly if you're talking a technology product. It has to be this price point, has to be aimed at this target segment, has to be this speed, has to have this much memory, pages and pages of requirements. But the interesting thing is Steve Jobs didn't give pages of requirements for this brief, he simply said this. When asked what he wanted from the future of Apple through these computers, he said, I want Bob Dylan songs. I mean, how crazy is that? What do you do with that? I mean, put yourself in the position of the design firm. You want Bob Dylan songs. Right. So I'm not going to go over what a Bob Dylan song means, but the thing that was interesting, well, actually I'll tell you briefly. I mean, he was looking for an emotional connection. He also wanted to run in the opposite direction, which is what Bob Dylan's been doing his whole career. Opposite direction of what IBM and everything was doing. But the interesting part about what that brief was about is that it was an intentionally unreasonable statement that smashed our perceptions of what computers are all about. An intentionally unreasonable statement that gets your thinking flowing in another direction really quickly. And this is the difference between prediction, right, which we're all trained to do and very good at doing, and provocation, right, which is giving us something we're not familiar with, not in our standard set of patterns. This is powerful because we are all so trapped in our normal patterns of thinking that we're not even aware of it. And it starts at a very young age. This is what education is, right? The more expertise or education we have in a certain field, the stronger our patterns become. Our ability to predict these patterns. So as soon as a pattern in our brain is triggered, you know, we follow it along and it's easy to predict. This is why so many companies have portfolios full of incremental ideas. because they're the ones that seem intuitively right, because they trigger a standard pattern. It never used to be this way. As kids, we didn't have these patterns. You watch any 4-year-old playing, they're busy experimenting with different approaches to their world. And then the adults get involved and they say, don't do it like that, do it like this. This is the right way, and this is how we learn. So expertise in any field is building up a stockpile of these patterns. Actually, the great educator, Sir Ken Robinson, tells that brilliant story of that little 4-year-old girl in art class. She never used to pay attention, but in this class she was, completely absorbed. So the teacher was curious and she went up to her and said, "What are you doing?" The little girl said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the little girl says, "They will in a minute." And that's exactly right. Kids are not afraid to have a go. They're not afraid to be wrong, right? They're not afraid to provoke. So I think there's far too much prediction going on in businesses around the world today, trying to predict sales forecasts, where the market's going. This is what gets them in this incremental trap, and far too little provocation going on. So to provoke, to come up with something like this intentionally unreasonable statement, this is what I call a disruptive hypothesis. And this is really where the process starts. So I talk about 5 stages: coming up with a disruptive hypothesis, turning that into a viable opportunity, taking that opportunity, turning it into an idea, taking that idea, shaping it into a practical solution, and then finally pitching that to someone. But it all starts with this intentionally unreasonable statement. So it's a difference between hypothesis as we normally consider it, which is we make a reasonable prediction, right? So if I have a cell phone that's not working, I can hypothesize that, oh, maybe it's the batteries. So if I charge it up and it works, hypothesis is correct. If the cell phone's still not working, I need a new hypothesis. So we make a reasonable prediction and we test it. Now, an unreasonable provocation would be, why does the cell phone need batteries at all? And it's an important distinction. And you can see them in every field. If we were looking at the soda industry, we would say, what do we take for granted about soda? What are some of the cliches? We say that soda is inexpensive, tastes good because of all the sugar, and advertised as aspirational. You know what I mean by that, right? Coke and Pepsi wrote the rule book on this. You know, this isn't soda. This is American democracy in a can. Now, what if we flipped those on their head, basically inverted them, and we had, that would give us soda is expensive, it tastes bad, and we advertise it as functional, meaning we stop telling people it's going to change their lives, we tell them it's going to give them a boost when they need it. Any guesses? Red Bull. Launched at double the price of Coca-Cola, placed no importance on taste. People say to me now, I like the taste of Red Bull. I can tell you in those early focus groups, they were spitting it out on the floor. Right? And they moved away from that aspirational marketing. Another example, who remembers the sitcoms of the late 80s and early 90s, like The Cosby Show, Family Matters? They were all driven by this rule. It was called the hugging and learning rule. So the teenage children would go off and get into trouble, come back, there'd be tension in the house, this tension would build through the episode, and then finally at the end, normally around the kitchen table, right, they'd work it all out. They'd all hug it out, and we've all learned something. They've learned something, the parents have learned something, the audience has learned something. Somebody came along and said, you know what, I am so sick of this hugging and learning cliche. New rule, no hugging and learning. No matter how much trouble the characters get into, they do not develop at all. Any guesses on this? Seinfeld. Yeah, George Costanza, anyone? All right, so that's an example of denying the cliche, completely getting rid of it. And the last example I'm going to talk about is really the need to exaggerate the scale of something to look differently from the start. I had some friends sitting around dinner one night and they were all discussing disrupting different industries, as most entrepreneurs do, right? They're always looking to attack something. So they started talking about apparel and they got down to socks and they said, you know what, why have we always bought socks in pairs? Wouldn't it be nuts if somebody started selling socks in sets of 3? Everyone thought, come on, that's nuts. That's not ownable, it's not usable. except for one guy, Jonah Storr, who couldn't get it out of his head. He thought, this sock category has been boring for way too long. I'm going to start selling socks in sets of 3 and none of them match. And what he found out was, after he experimented with this, is that 8 to 12-year-old girls love socks that don't match. Right? They've had a venture capital funding, about $20 million from Canada and partners. There's 6 retail locations, 150 employees selling socks that don't match. Now the key to this is, what was the problem they addressed? There was no problem. It's not a problem to buy socks in pairs. It's not a problem to match your socks. We're also obsessed with looking at the big problems that need fixing, that we miss everything else. So we miss all the small tension points around us. So to conclude, I'm just going to say where to start with your disruptive hypotheses is to start with things that aren't broken. In business, we're so obsessed with focusing on spotting the big broken problems that we never innovate in the right way. So start with things that aren't broken. Use a disruptive hypothesis to flip things upside down and deliberately break it down. That is the way I believe we can get to true disruptive innovation. And it starts with disrupting the way you think. There's never been a better time to reinvent everything that's all around us. So please enjoy the possibilities. There are many. Thanks for your attention.
You talked there about a lot of the examples you gave were outside companies, companies that came in from outside and disrupted other companies.
Yeah.
And you did allude to the difficulties that established companies, successful companies have to disrupt themselves. Have you got any examples of companies that have, established companies that have succeeded in doing that, and how they succeeded in doing that? What challenges they overcame, what practices they put in place to be able to disrupt themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. That is what I fundamentally believe, and if this didn't come through in the presentation, it should have. Normally innovation is created by outsiders because they don't have the same set of expertise, so they don't have those same fixed patterns that we're talking about. Okay, so just about in the history of innovation, it's littered with innovations that are started by outsiders. But I truly believe that inside the organisation, they can adopt and learn the same habits that entrepreneurs and outsiders use to disrupt industries. And I mean, that's what I'm passionate about teaching people. I'm teaching them inside the organisation how to deliberately break their modus operandi and their standard patterns on demand. Now that has some organisational behavioural issues as well, which is a long answer we probably don't have time to get into. But, you know, it really starts at the individual level though. How can they think differently about the business that they're in and their competition? That's where we start.
You mentioned the concept of breakthroughs and turning points, and you started your session talking about that there's no shortage of ideas. So my question would be, is there a process or guidelines that you would say to define what ideas are potential breakthroughs and which ones will simply not make it? Because you don't want to invest in everything that you find, so how do you really choose the breakthroughs and the ones that are not?
Yeah, it's a good question, because that is the key. But when I say there was many ideas out there already, I believe that they're not all that inspiring, right? They don't have much disruptive impact because they're of the incremental kind. For an organisation, that's still important, but what I tell them that they have to do is also have a focus on building a portfolio of unconventional strategy options, right? Strategy options that are going to challenge their existing business model, you know, their existing products and services. And it's most important that they do that at the peak of their success, because that's where they're most vulnerable. Now, when they have these unconventional strategies, you actually have to go through a process of determining if they deliver value. And so you have to experiment with them and prototype them, and that's where we go through the other 4 steps. And it's key to do that, because disruption for disruption's sake is just annoying. It has to deliver value at the end of the day. So it's like the socks example. You know, the founder of Little Mismatched, all he had was this crazy hypothesis, and he started experimenting with it, but he had to find out who would find value in socks that don't match. And that's where he had to get samples done and he had to prototype the idea and he had to get feedback from 8 to 12-year-old girls because he's not an 8 to 12-year-old girl. And that's part of the filtering process. And I'll end that question by saying you have to be right at the end, okay? Which means, and this is different from most innovation or new product development processes, you have to be right at every stage in most new product development processes. You have to get the research validated before you can go into concepts. Concepts have to be validated before you can go on to prototypes. Prototypes have to be validated, etc. With disruptive innovation, that will kill you. The need to be right at every stage will round off all the edges and you'll end up with something so generic at the end, it's defeated the whole purpose. So with disruptive innovation and disruptive thinking, it's only necessary to be right at the end. In fact, you have to be wrong at different stages in the process to be able to see the right answer. So the whole disruptive hypothesis, this is why the process starts there. And I remember it this way. You have to be wrong at the start in order to be right at the end. It's the only way you're going to get to something interesting.
To follow up on your last point, you have a disruptive idea, but the ways of evaluating and developing those ideas are pretty stuck in tradition.
Yes.
Right? They're not disruptive. And I understand you have to be right at the end, not every point in between.
Yeah.
But how do you protect against the more powerful or higher ranking individual just, going on an instinct or a gut, which at the end of the day fails a lot of the intermittent steps and fails in the marketplace?
Yeah, there's a couple of tricks to this. This is why, the fifth stage that I describe in the book is the disruptive pitch. Because I think, you can have the best idea in the world, but if you don't have a compelling story to the investors or the executives on why it really matters to the business, it's not going anywhere, right? So I think this is critical. So there's a couple of tricks. The first is every VC that I know says, or executive for that matter, says, I want something new and innovative, disruptive even, because that's a key word at the moment, but give me 3 examples of where it's been successful in the past. Right? Now this is the problem. So by the time you get to that point where you actually have to present it to whoever holds the purse strings to get this through, you have to make it familiar, right? So the way we do that is through analogy. This is one of the tricks. So you want it to be disruptive yet familiar. So normally with the idea or the opportunity you're presenting, anchor it in a familiar analogy, not in the same industry, but in another industry. Therefore, they get their example of where it's been successful in the past, but it's for another industry. And that's one way of anchoring it in something that they feel intuitive and know. Like Little Miss Match, when they were pitching to people and it's part of the brand story, they said, we're doing for socks what Starbucks did for coffee. It's a simple thing, but it gave the VCs an image in their mind of how big this thing could become. A key one is you wouldn't go see a Hollywood movie that was boy meets girl and they live happily ever after, right? But that's the way most people pitch ideas in an organisation. Product meets user need and sells happily ever after. Boring and not convincing. So you'd only go see a movie if it was boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy wins girl back. Okay, the boy loses girl, that's where it gets interesting. Now in disruptive pitch terms, that's where you've got to give the executives or the VCs, you've got to build some tension, you've got to build their curiosity, right? That's the turning point that we alluded to earlier. So what's your moment, right? The counterintuitive insight that drives the idea you're trying to present. Most people leave that out.
You alluded to it earlier, the key, what would be the key point of finding a new unconventional strategy?
The key point really is that you have to be breaking cliches or patterns somehow. So, the key is really to start with a disruptive hypothesis. However, the second stage is really important too, because the reason why most big disruptive hypotheses don't make it past the hypothesis stage isn't because of their creative differentiation. Because of their lack of customer insight. So nobody's done the work to really work out what what need is this really fulfilling? You know, what's the big insight that sort of pulls this together? That doesn't come from focus groups. It doesn't come from quantitative research. It really comes from qualitative, contextual observation of the context in which your hypothesis will live. It's really having empathy for what's going on there, and instead of the pain points, which are big problems, you're looking for tension points. These are things that aren't big enough to be problems, but they're still little frustrations. They're the frustrations everyone's grown completely complacent about, and that's why people ignore them. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your attention. Cheers.